The History of Poland podcast, episode 40. The Mongols have arrived. Hello and welcome back. Last time we left off with a serious problem. Poland had almost irreparably fractured. Everyone is fighting against everyone else. No one really has centralized authority over the military. And it seems like every time one problem is solved, three more pop up in its place. What Poland needed at this time was a cunning leader who would come along and unite the various factions together. Then, after a period of a decade or two, that leader would have settled many of the domestic issues facing the Poles. They would have centralized the parts that needed centralization. They would have devolved decision-making authority to noble families and enabled people to go about their lives. That's not what Poland gets, though. Instead, Poland gets the Mongols. Before I jump into the Mongol invasion of Poland, I want to briefly explain my approach to telling this story. In short, I'm only going to be focusing on the Mongol invasion of Poland, not the Mongol invasion of Europe as a whole. While that is a fascinating story, it quickly leads to a story that will take a long time to tell, and frankly isn't the focus of this particular podcast. But, and there is a but, I still want everyone to have the option of learning about the Mongol invasion of Europe as a whole. So I've decided that if you want to hear about the larger invasion of Europe, you can get those episodes on Patreon. You can get that by going to patreon.com/History of Poland podcast. But back to today's episode. The year is 1241, Poland is a mess, and the well-organized army of the Mongols has arrived. Who are these Mongols? Well, they are something else. The Mongol Empire was founded by Genghis Khan in, you guessed it, the region of modern-day Mongolia. Initially, Genghis had united the warring nomad steppe tribes together under his rule before letting his forces loose against the world. The opening of that Pandora's box led to the Mongols conquering the Western Xia Empire, the Jin dynasty of China, and the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. And if you thought my Polish pronunciation wasn't very good, then just wait until you get my Chinese pronunciation. But anyway, how were the Mongols so effective at conquering these lands? There are endless studies devoted to this topic, but for our purposes today, there are two we need to know about. The first is that the Mongols were very flexible in terms of the military tactics they utilized to attack their enemies. Whether that meant adopting siege warfare, feigning retreats, using chemicals and gunpowder, or employing psychological warfare, the Mongols would use whatever they thought had the best chance of success. The second was the combination of the horse and the bow. According to Professor Morris Rosabi in his paper All the Khan's Horses, quote, "The Mongols prized their horses primarily for the advantages they offered in warfare. In combat, the horses were fast and flexible, and Genghis Khan was the first leader to capitalize fully on these strengths. After hit-and-run raids, for example, his horsemen could race back and quickly disappear into their native steppes. Enemy armies from the sedentary agricultural societies to the south frequently had to abandon their pursuit because they were not accustomed to long rides on horseback and thus could not move as quickly. Nor could these farmer soldiers leave their fields for extended periods to chase after the Mongols. The Mongols had developed a composite bow made out of sinew and horn and were skilled at shooting it while riding, which gave them the upper hand against ordinary foot soldiers. With a range of more than 350 yards, the bow was superior to the contemporaneous English longbow, whose range was only 250 yards. A wood and leather saddle, which was rubbed with sheep's fat to prevent cracking and shrinkage, allowed the horses to bear the weight of their riders for long periods and also permitted the riders to retain a firm seat. Their saddlebags contained cooking pots, dried meat, yogurt, water bottles, and other essentials for lengthy expeditions. Finally, a sturdy stirrup enabled horsemen to be steadier and thus more accurate in shooting when mounted. A Chinese chronicler recognized the horse's value to the Mongols, observing that, by nature, they are good at riding and shooting. Therefore, they took possession of the world through this advantage of bow and horse. Genghis Khan understood the importance of horses and insisted that his troops be solicitous of their steeds. A cavalryman normally had 3 or 4, so that each was, at one time or another, given a respite from bearing the weight of the rider during a lengthy journey. Before combat, leather coverings were placed on the head of each horse, and its body was covered with armor. After combat, Mongol horses could traverse the most rugged terrain and survive on little fodder. According to Marco Polo, the horse also provided sustenance to its rider on long trips during which all the food had been consumed. On such occasions, the rider would cut the horse's veins and drink the blood that spurted forth. Marco Polo reported, perhaps with some exaggeration, that a horseman could, by nourishing himself on his horse's blood, ride quite 10 days' marches without eating any cooked food and without lighting a fire. And because its milk offered additional sustenance during extended military campaigns, a cavalryman usually preferred a mare as a mount. The milk was often fermented to produce kumis, or arak, a potent alcoholic drink liberally consumed by the Mongols. In short, as one commander stated, "If the horse dies, I die. If it lives, I survive." Mobility and surprise characterized the military expeditions led by Genghis Khan and his commanders, and the horse was crucial for such tactics and strategy. Horses could, without exaggeration, be referred to as the intercontinental ballistic missiles of the 13th century. End quote. While that was a bit of a long quote, it does an exceptionally good job of describing the unique advantage that the Mongols had when they waged war. These military tactics came to bear upon Poland in 1241. The overall strategy of this campaign had been designed by Subutai, one of Genghis's primary tacticians. In addition to Subutai, the campaign was under the nominal head of Batu, who was the grandson of Genghis, though not nearly as expansive as Subutai in military matters. After devastating the Rus, Subutai knew that the next natural target was Hungary. Yet he also knew that the king of Hungary, Bela, would be quick to call on Polish reinforcements when he faced this army, especially considering his close ties to both Henry the Pious, the son of Henry the Bearded, and Boleslav the Chaste, his son-in-law. With that knowledge in mind, Subutai sent one of his armies into Poland, under the command of Baidar, Kadar, and Orda, all senior, experienced Mongol military leaders. Now, normally, I would at this point quote Jan Długosz's coverage of these events, because he is the Polish historian associated with them. But we run into a problem. Jan is very biased. You see, after the Mongol invasion of Europe, the Mongols, or as they were called at the time, the Tartars, became the very picture of evil in the eyes of Europe. These horsemen who rode in with incredible strength and dashed the best armies of Europe to pieces were a plague sent by God, at least in the eyes of the chroniclers at the time. As such, it's very difficult to just quote from any of the chroniclers at length without continually devolving into ad hominem attacks against the Mongols, which isn't really a productive use of any of our time. I mean, just as an example, here's how Długosz describes the Mongols. Quote, "The Tatars are a people vile in temperament and in behavior cruel. Of low stature, they are short in the leg, have flat, wry noses and broad, hairless faces. They have small, darting eyes, broad, heavy chests, nasty, swarthy complexions, and powerful bodies. They live on mare's milk, meat, and blood, and are content with modest fare that is easy to prepare, eating raw, uncooked food and millet mixed with horse's blood. They are fond of, and ever ready for sensual pleasures, and the delights of the flesh. They endure frost as well as heat. To each other they are polite, kind, loyal, truthful, and humane, but with strangers they are at first ingratiating, but later become cunning, devious, mendacious, and importunate. They are by no means ready to give." End quote. So, in listening to that, you can hear that there are some bits of truth and some bits of inaccuracy, which is understandable, considering Jan is writing from a Polish perspective about an enemy that is about to thoroughly defeat Poland. But we're not here to relive medieval Polish grievances. We're here to talk history. With all of that in mind, I'm going to turn to the book The Devil's Horseman, The Mongol Invasion of Europe by James Chambers. It's an excellent narrative of these events. Chambers tells us that, quote, "While Batu's army was advancing into Hungary, Baidar and Kadan were marching through Poland. In February 1241, they entered the territory of Lublin, burning the cities of Lublin and Zawichost and laying waste the countryside. They were moving slowly, and yet after crossing the frozen Vistula on the ice, they were able to sack Sandomir, which was defended by no more than a normal garrison, and pause to plunder its Cistercian monastery without being threatened by a relieving army. The Poles had obviously been taken by complete surprise. With no apparent opposition, the conditions seemed ideal for a quick contest. But unfortunately, Baidar and Kadan's objective was to draw the northern European armies away from Hungary, and it did not yet look as though these armies had even been mobilized. Although their own army was already dangerously small, they decided to divide it and spread alarm over as wide an area as possible. In the last resort, Mongols could always retreat faster than any European army could advance. While Kadan rode northwest to attack Mazovia, Baidar took a calculated risk and continued his advance southwest, directly towards the Polish capital at Krakow. Raiding and burning and drawing attention to itself, Baidar's vanguard advanced to within a few miles of Krakow, and then slowly turned back as though returning to its camp with its plunder and its prisoners." End quote. This was the beginning move of a classic tactics that the Mongols employed. They would feign a retreat and ride away. Then their opponents would guess that the Mongols had been defeated and race after them, with their heavy armor weighing them down. The result? Well, almost always the same. Chambers continues, saying, quote, "Vladimir, the Palatine of Sandomir and Krakow, who commanded the armies of Boleslav the Chaste, rode out of the city in considerable strength and attacked. The Mongols broke and fled, and the prisoners escaped, but Vladimir had given himself away. Boleslav's army would be one of the first to march to the rescue of his father-in-law, the King of Hungary, and Baidar had not only found it, but had lured it out from behind the city walls, where it might have held out long enough for the other Polish dukes to reach Hungary unopposed or to come to its relief in dangerously superior numbers. When the Mongols did not reappear, the soldiers of Sandomir and Krakow, believing that the raiders were on the run, began to advance, and on the 18th of March at Chmielnik, only 11 miles from Krakow, Baidar ambushed them. Vladimir and most of his soldiers died in a hail of Mongol arrows. As the battle was drawing to a close, a Mongol reconnaissance unit approached Krakow. Fugitives from the battle had already passed through, and Boleslav and his family had left for Hungary with all the treasure they could carry. While the citizens were preparing to abandon the city and take refuge in the forests, a trumpeter continued to sound the alarm until a Mongol arrow struck him down. When the main body of the Mongol army arrived, Krakow was deserted, and on the 24th of March it was burned. To this day the disaster is commemorated. Every hour, on the hour, a trumpeter from the Krakow Fire Department sounds the call from the four corners of the cathedral tower. But the call is never finished. It splutters abruptly to an end just at the moment when the Mongol arrow struck the lookout." End quote. Chambers continues on, saying, quote, "At Liegnitz, Henry's hastily assembled army numbered no more than 25,000 men, and many of them were untrained and ill-equipped. Mieszko of Opeln had brought his army, and the Margrave of Moravia had sent an army under the command of his son Boleslav, but they were mostly made up of the usual inexperienced feudal levies. Many of the conscripts from Great Poland and the large contingent of volunteers assembled by the Bavarian gold miners from Goldberg in Silesia were armed with no more than the tools of their trade. The detachments of the Knights Templar from France and the Hospitallers were too small to be of any consequence. Apart from Henry's own army of mercenaries and regular Silesian soldiers, who were both experienced and distinguished, the only other formidable unit in the combined army was the splendid contingent of Teutonic Knights, led by their Prussian Landmeister, Popo von Osterna. The morale of the ignorant conscripts was raised by the confidence and magnificence of the Christian knights with their banners and their fine armor. But although these conscripts might have been fiercely courageous defenders on the city walls, it was hopeless to imagine that they could be effective on a battlefield." End quote. The battle was a decisive defeat for the Poles. In the end, Chambers tells us that, quote, "After the battle, the Mongols recorded the number of every dead by cutting an ear from every body and collecting them into 9 large sacks, which they sent to Batu." End quote. In addition to the general death of the European armies, Duke Henry was killed trying to escape and then beheaded, his head then being used as a propaganda tool to discourage defenders and for people fighting back. From there, the Mongol army kept Wenceslas's army from assisting Bela in Hungary, while also pillaging the towns they passed through in Moravia. Chambers tells us that, quote, "The Silesian and Moravian towns were so depopulated that after the war they had to be resettled with German immigrants and given tax immunity and other privileges to revive their economies. If it had not been for the many forests and marshes in which fugitives were too difficult to find, the slaughter of peasants and farmers would have made the depopulation complete." End quote. From there, the branch of the Mongol army then circled back south and headed into Hungary, with an astonished Poland in their wake. The result of this invasion was so shocking to the Poles that they had trouble coming to terms with what had happened. Chambers explains how the invasion was viewed through the eyes of the Poles who lived through it, saying, quote, "Stupefied and shattered, the Poles were unable to understand what had happened to them. They knew nothing about the Mongols or their purpose, and from the events of the 3 terrible months, they began to deduce their own version of the campaign and embellish it with propaganda. Confused reports of the smokescreen at Liegnitz and the strong-smelling incense which the Mongols burned beneath their standards were combined into a theory that the Allies had been subjected to some form of fiendish gas attack. As always, the incredible mobility of the Mongol army had made the Poles assess its strength at 5 times greater than it was, and its sudden withdrawal allowed them to believe that their dauntless resistance had inflicted so many casualties that the Mongols had been forced to abandon an invasion. Forever after the Battle of Liegnitz, 7 noble families from Silesia and Moravia wore the Mongol cap as a mark of their ancestors' presence at what they remembered as a Pyrrhic victory. Bewildered chroniclers made up names for the Mongol commanders. Baidar, for example, was known as Peta, and as time went by, they recorded the universally accepted reports of Allied victories in battles that had never taken place, adding to the impression that the Mongols had been driven out of Poland. Records of 2 of these spurious victories were used in a famous 19th century forgery, the Koningenhofer manuscript, but it is now certain that Wenceslas never met, let alone defeated, the main body of the Mongol army. And the report of a victory by Yaroslav of Sternberg in an attack on Olmütz, where Baidar was supposed to have been killed, is merely a misrepresentation of a raid made by the Hungarians and the Cumans in 1253. Nevertheless, several serious histories of Central Europe still refer to Liegnitz as a Polish victory, and the most widespread misunderstanding, caused by the use of nicknames and the awesome difficulty encountered in translating Oriental characters, has managed to survive into the majority of general history books today." End quote. And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode. This won't be the last we hear of the Mongols, but this is by far the most decisive encounter that Poland has with the Golden Horde of the Mongols. But just because the Mongols are done in Poland for now, doesn't mean they're done in Europe. As I mentioned before, if you want to get the broader story of the invasion of Europe and a deeper dive into Mongol history, head on over to patreon.com/historyofpolandpodcast. And if you'd like to stick around, we'll be continuing on with our focus on Polish history next week. Poland will have to come to terms with this invasion, Poland will try to move on, and maybe, just maybe, we'll reunify the state. Just maybe though. Until next time, thanks for listening.